Hello, good morning. Happy Sunday. Happy Sunday morning. First thing I want to say is share this live. Just put some new batteries in, so the audio should be good. But share this live. What else? What's coming out today? New podcast episode is out today. You can get it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor. I think all the major podcast platforms. And subscribe to the newsletter. New newsletter out tomorrow. We're going to be continuing our reading of A People's History of the United States. So far, we've only read the introduction in about 5 pages. And so far, what this chapter is titled Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. And so far, it covers things like Columbus, when he first came over here, one of the first notes that he got is how good is this in his logs, how he believes he is of the mindset that the people that he found, which he called the Indians, would make good slaves. From the very beginning, from one of the first noted logged appearances about Columbus' interaction with these folks. So we're going to be picking back up where we left off. Okay, let's see. Okay, chapter 1, page 5. Women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Las Casas described sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates and leave them as they please, without offense, jealousy, or anger. They multiply in great abundance. Pregnant women work to the last minute and give birth almost painlessly. Up the next day, they bathe in the river and are clean and healthy as before giving birth. If they tire of their men, they give themselves abortions with herbs that force stillbirths, covering their shameful parts with leaves or cotton cloth. Although on the whole, Indian men and women look upon total nakedness with as much casualness as we look upon a man's head or at his hands. The Indians, La Casa said, have no religion, at least no temples. They live in large communal bell-shaped buildings housing up to 600 people at one time, made of very strong wood and roofed with palm leaves. They prize bird feathers of various colors, beads made of fish bones, and green and white stones with which they adorn their ears and lips. But they put no value on gold and other precious things. They lack all other manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and relying exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token covet the possessions of their friends and expect the same degree of liberality. In Book 2 of his History of the Indies, Las Casas, who at first urged replacing Indians by black slaves, thinking they were stronger and would survive, but later relented when he saw the effect on Africans, tells about the treatment of the Indians by the Spaniards. It is a unique account and deserves to be quoted at length. Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives. But our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder, then, if they try to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against the Indians. Las Casas tells how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, and after a while refused to walk any distance. They rode the backs of Indians if they were in a hurry, or were carried on hammocks by Indians running in relays. In this case, they also had Indians carry large leaves to shade them from the sun, and others to fan them with goose wings. Total control led to total cruelty. The Spaniards thought nothing of knifing Indians by tens and twenties, and of cutting slices off them to test the sharpness of their blades. Las Casas tells how two of these so-called Christians met two Indian boys one day, each carrying a parrot. They took the parrots and for fun beheaded the boys. Holy shit. This is a really graphic and a really bloody chapter, but I think it's important that it is graphic and bloody because what these men came over here and did was graphic and bloody and cruel. And I don't, at least to me, it was not taught at least to me, it was not taught to any length, really. The Indians' attempts to defend themselves failed, and when they ran off into the hills, they were found and killed. So Las Casas reports they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn for help. He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom and bottom to top 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirt on their backs. To wash it in the river, while those who wash gold stay in the water all the time with their backs bent so constantly it breaks them. And when water invades the mines, the most strenuous task of all is to dry the mines by scooping up pans full of water and throwing it up outside. After each 6 or 8 months' work in the mines, which was the time required of each crew to dig enough gold for melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. Wow. While the men were sent many miles away to the mines, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Thus, husband and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. 7,000. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And what we're talking about here, what we're reading about, this is genocide. There's no other way around it. There's no other way to talk about it. This is genocide. When you force these men to work in these mines in cruel and unusual conditions, to where they are dying every day. And when you force these women to work in other conditions, separate the husband and wife, and you force these women to work cruel and unusual conditions as well, and to where they're killing their babies, this is genocide. There's no way to circumvent this. There's no way around this. This is genocide. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful and fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. When he arrived on Hispaniola in 1508, Las Casas says there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians. So that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Thus began the history, 500 years ago, of the European invasion on the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, even if his figures are exaggerations, were there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, or less than 1 million, as some historians have calculated, or 8 million, as others believe? Is conquest, slavery, death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it all starts with heroic adventure. There is no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. Past the elementary and high schools, there are only occasional hints of something else. Samuel Elliott Morrison, the Harvard historian, was the most distinguished writer on Columbus, the author of a multi-volume biography, and was himself a sailor who retraced Columbus' route across the Atlantic. In his popular book, Christopher Columbus, written in 1954, he tells about the enslavement and the killing. The cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. That is on one page, buried halfway into the telling of a grand romance. In the book's last paragraph, Morrison sums up his views on Columbus. Okay, this is a quote from his book. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God, and in his own mission as a Christ-bearer to lands beyond the seas. His stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. One can outright lie about the past, or one can omit facts which might lead to unacceptable conclusions. Morrison does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not omit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word one can use: genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things more important to him. Outright lying or quiet omission takes the risk of a discovery which, when made, might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then to bury them in a mass of other information is to say to the reader with a certain infectious calm, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not that important. It should weigh very little in our final judgments. It should affect very little what we do in this world. It is not that the historian can avoid emphasis of some facts and not of others. This is as natural to him as to the mapmaker, who, in order to produce a usable drawing for practical purposes, must first flatten and distort the shape of the earth, then choose out of the bewildering mass of geographic information those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. My argument cannot be against selection, simplification, emphasis, which are inevitable for both mapmakers and historians. But the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity for a common purpose shared by all the people who need maps. The historian's distortion is more than technical. It is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests, where any chosen emphasis supports some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual. Furthermore, this ideological interest is not openly expressed in the way a mapmaker's technical interest is obvious. No. It is presented as if all readers of history had a common interest which historians serve to the best of their ability. This is not... This is not intentional deception. The historian has been trained in a society in which education and knowledge are put forward as technical problems of excellence and not as tools for contending social classes, race, and nations. Hold on. The wind is starting to get a little windy up here. Okay, here we go. Page 9. To emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide is not a technical necessity, but an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. In this, if we can just relate this back to Rockford for a second. This is the type of things I feel are problems with Rockford. These are the type of things that I feel like is rooted in Rockford, to where we have... it took me reading African Americans in early Rockford to know that the first people who came, the first settlers of this city, were slave owners. And to where I feel like Rockford is in a perpetual state of denial, a perpetual state of trying to omit the facts of history, trying to omit these things, these crimes against people of color, the crimes against Africans, the crimes against women, the crimes against all these... My fault, hold on, that threw me off. So I feel like it's important to tell the truth and the whole truth, not to omit things, especially about your city and where you come from, and to know that, and to know how we got here, and to how things came to be. My point is not that we must, in telling history, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus. It is too late for that. It would be a useless scholarly exercise of morality. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary place to play for progress. This is in parentheses. Hiroshima and Vietnam to save Western civilization. Nuclear... My fault, hold on. Okay. Never mind, that's not important. But the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress, that is still with us. One reason these atrocities are still with us is that we have learned to bury them in a mass of other facts. As radioactive wastes are buried in containers in the earth, we have learned to give them exactly the same proportion of attention that teachers and writers often give them in the most respectable of classrooms and textbooks. This learned sense of moral proportion, coming from the apparent objectivity of the scholar, is accepted more easily than when it comes from politicians at press conferences. It is therefore more deadly. The treatment of heroes and their victims The quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress is only one aspect of a certain approach to history, in which the past is told from the point of view of governments, conquerors, diplomats, and leaders. It is as if they say, my fault. It is as if they, like Columbus, deserve universal acceptance. As if they, the founding fathers, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, the leading members of Congress, the famous justices of the Supreme Court, represent the nation as a whole. The pretense is that there really is such a thing as the United States, subject to occasional conflicts and quarrels, but fundamentally a community of people with common interests. It is as if there were... Hold on, let me start that over. It is as if there really is a national interest represented in the Constitution, in territorial expansions, in the law passed by Congress, the decisions of the court, the development of capitalism, and the culture of education and the mass media. History is a memory of the states, wrote Henry Kissinger in his first book, A World Restored, in which he produced to tell the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders of Austria and England, ignoring the millions who suffered from those statesmen policies. From his standpoint, the peace that Europe had before the French Revolution was restored by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for factory workers in England, farmers in France, people of color in Asia and Africa, women and children everywhere, except in the upper classes, it was a world of conquest, violence, hunger, and exploitation. A world not restored, but disintegrated. My viewpoint in telling the history of the United States is different. That we must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country, presented as the history of a family, conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes exploding, most often repressed, between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is a job of thinking people such as Albert Camus suggested not to be on the side of the executioners. Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history, I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint... I feel like I'm saying this wrong. That's a problem. Is it Arawaks? Of the Constitution from the viewpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the Civil War as seen by the New York Irish, of the Mexican War as seen by the deserting soldiers of Scott's army, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mines, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by the black soldiers on Luzon, the Gilded Age as seen by Southern farmers, the First World War as seen by socialists, the Second World War as seen by pacifists, the New Deal as seen by African Americans in Harlem, the post-war American empire as seen by peons in Latin America, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others. My point is not to grieve for the victims and denounce the executions. Those tears, that anger, cast into the past, deplete our moral energy for the present. And the lines are not always clear. In the long run, the oppressor... In the short run, I'm not even going to say that. In the short run, and so far, human history has consisted only of short runs. The victims themselves, desperate and tainted with the culture that oppresses them, turn on other victims. Still understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical. Still understanding the complexities, this book will be skeptical of governments. Skeptical of governments and their attempts through politics and culture to ensnare ordinary people in a giant web of nationhood pretending to be a common interest. I will try not to overlook the cruelties that victims inflict on one another as they are jammed together in the boxcars of the system. I don't want to romanticize them, but I do remember a statement I once read. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. I don't want to invent victories for people's movement, but to think that history writing must aim to simply recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. If history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, their ability to join together, and occasionally to win. I am supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past fugitive moments of compassion rather than in its solid centuries of warfare. That, being as blunt as I can, is my approach to the history of the United States. The reader may as well know that before going on. What Columbus did to the it's definitely not Arawaks. What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, I believe it's Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, and the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and to the Powhatans. The Aztec civilization of Mexico came out of the heritage of Mayan. Zapotec? I don't know. Again, correct me if you have any knowledge of this and know the proper pronunciation of some of these words. Please correct me. It built enormous constructions from stone tools and human labor, developed a writing system and a priesthood. It also engaged in, let us not overlook, the ritual killings of thousands of people as sacrifices to the gods. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain innocence. And when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz, and a bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, Clad in iron, it was thought that he was a legendary Aztec man-god who had died 300 years before with a promise to return. The mysterious... Okay. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Quetzalcoatl. I have no idea. I apologize for that. And so they welcomed him with great hospitality. That was Hernando Cortez, come from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners, and blessed by the deputies of God with one obsessive goal: to find gold. In the mind of Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs, there must have been a certain doubt about whether Cortez was indeed this man-god, because he had sent 100 runners to Cortez, bearing enormous treasures, gold and silver wrought into objects of fantastic beauty, but at the same time begging him to go back. Cortez then began his march of death from town to town, using deception, turning Aztec against Aztec, killing with the kind of deliberateness that accompanies a strategy to paralyze the will of the population by a sudden frightful deed. And so he invited the head of the nation to the square. And when they came with thousands of unarmed retainers, Cortez's small army of Spaniards posted around the square with cannon, armed with crossbows and mounted on horses, massacred them down to the last man. Genocide. Then they looted the city and moved on. All in the name of gold, all in the name of selfishness, all in the name of greed. Man, this is really tough to read at certain points. When their cavalcade of murder was over, they were in Mexico City. Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization, shattered, was in the hands of the Spaniard. All this is told in Spaniards' own accounts. In Peru, the other Spaniard conquistador, Pizarro, used the same tactics and for the same reasons. The frenzy in the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, to pay the bondholders and stockholders of the expeditions, to finance the monarchical and bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of the new money. I wish he had a stand. That's what we need the stand back. I'm getting tired. To spur the growth of the new money economy rising out of feudalism. To participate in what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital. Let me wait for this to go by. These were the violent beginnings of an intricate system of technology, business, politics, and culture that would dominate the world for the next 5 centuries. In the North American English colonies, the pattern was set up early. As Columbus had said, as Columbus had set it in the islands of the Bahamas. In 1585, before there were any permanent English settlements in Virginia, Richard Grenville landed there with 7 ships. The Indians he met were hospitable, but when one of them stole a small silver cup, Grenville sacked and burned the whole Indian village. Just that quote alone reminded me of the now infamous quote of the Rockford Police Department Deputy Chief Kurt Whisenhand. Sometimes the many gotta pay for the sins of the few. And that's this same type of mindset. Burning down the whole village because somebody supposedly stole a small silver cup. That's the same type of mindset to where Fairgrounds, Blackhawk, and these areas are created to become police states, to where police officers use force on a daily basis, unnecessary force, excessive force, force just to use force. Jamestown itself was set up inside the territory of an Indian confederacy, led by the chief Powhatan. I'm gonna go Powhatan. Powhatan watched the English settle on his people's land, but did not attack, maintaining a posture of coolness. When the English were going through their starving time in the winter of 1610, some of them ran off to join the Indians, where they would at least be fed. When the summer came, the governor of the colony sent a messenger to ask Powhatan to return the runaways, whereupon Powhatan, according to the English account, replied with no other than proud and disdainful answers. Some soldiers were therefore sent out to take revenge. I believe that's revenge. They fell upon an Indian settlement, killed 15 or 16 Indians, burned the houses down, cut down the corn growing around the village, took the queen of the tribe and her children into boats, then ended up throwing the children overboard and shooting out their brains in the water. Shooting spelled S-H. Nah, I'm not even gonna. Okay. The queen was later taken off and stabbed to death. And this is because people ran off because they weren't being taken care of. People ran off because the conditions that they themselves were in were so cruel. 12 years later, the Indians, alarmed as the English settlements kept growing in numbers, apparently decided to try to wipe them out for good. They went out on a rampage and massacred 347 men, women, and children. From then on, it was total war. Not able to enslave the Indians and not able to live with them, the English decided to exterminate them. Edmund Morgan writes in his History of Early Virginia, American Slavery, American Freedom, since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions. Let them settle down and plant their corn wherever they choose. And then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible, and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of the massacre, the English had avenged the deaths of that day many times over. In that first year of the white man in Virginia, 1607, I'm struggling with this one. Powhatan had addressed a plea to John Smith that turned out prophetic. How authentic it is may be in doubt, but it is so much like so many Indian statements that it may be taken as, if not the rough letter of that first plea, the exact spirit of it. Okay, so this is the letter. I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown and old, and must die soon. My authority must descend to my brothers. Powhatan. I'm sorry. I cannot do these names. My fault. I apologize. I should learn to do these names, and I apologize that I have not. But he said the names of the 3 brothers. And then to my 2 sisters, and then to my 2 daughters. Let me start this over. I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war better than any man in my country. I am now grown old and must die soon. My authority must ascend to my brothers, then to my 2 sisters, and then to my 2 daughters. I wish them to know as much as I do, and that your love to them may be like mine to you. Why will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and run out into the woods. Then you will starve for wronging your friends. Why are you jealous of us? We are unarmed and willing to give what you ask, if you come in a friendly manner, and not so simple as not to know that it is much better to eat a good meal, sleep comfortably, live quietly with my wives and children, laugh and be merry with the English, and trade for the copper and hatchets, than to run away from them, and to lie in cold in the woods, feed on acorns, roots, and such trash, and be so hunted I can neither eat nor sleep. In these wars, my men must sit up watching, and if a twig break, they all cry out, "Here comes Captain Smith." So I must end my miserable life. Take away your guns and swords, the cause of all your jealousy, or you may all die in the same manner. When the Pilgrims came to New England, that's the end of my fault. That's the end of his plea. When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming not to vacant land, but to territory inhabited by tribes of Indians. The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land, and therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right to it. A natural right had no legal standing. The Puritans also appealed to the Bible, Psalms chapter 2, verse 8. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possessions. And to justify their use of force, to take the land, they cited the Romans, chapter 13, verse 2. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and that they resist shall receive to themselves damnation. The Puritans lived in the uneasy truth with the local Indians, who occupied what is now southern Connecticut and Rhode Island. But they wanted them out of their way. They wanted their land. And they seemed to also want to establish their rule firmly over Connecticut settlers in their area. The murder of a white trader, Indian kidnapper, and troublemaker became an excuse to take war on the locals in 1636. A punitive expedition left Boston to attack the Narragansett Indians on Block Island, who were lumped with other Indians. As Governor Winthrop wrote, they had commissioned to put to death the men of Block Island, but to spare the women and children, and to bring them away, and to take possession of the island, and from thence to go to the they call them Pequods. We go to the Pequods to demand the murderers of Captain Stone and other English, and 1,000 fathom for damages. And this language here is very odd, very of the times. And some of their children as hostages, which if they should refuse, they were to attain by force. The English landed and killed some Indians, but the rest hid in the thick forests of the land, and the English went from one deserted village to the next, destroying crops. Then they sailed back to the mainland and raided villages along the coast, destroying crops again. One of the officers of that expedition, in his account, gives some insight. The Indians spying of us came running into multitudes along the waterside, crying, "What cheer, Englishmen, what cheer? What do you come for?" They, not thinking we intended war, went on cheerfully. Wow. So the war with the Indians began. Massacres took place on both sides. The English developed a tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortez and later. My fault. Let me start that one over. The English developed a tactic of warfare used earlier by Cortez and later in the 20th century, even more systematically, deliberate attacks on non-combatants for the purpose of terrorizing the enemy. This is that do make me think about hearing about and reading about every so often. I feel like these drone strikes and the killings that are done over in the Middle East, where at times dozens upon dozens of civilians are killed by these drone strikes. Okay. Let's see, where were we? Okay. This is ethnohistorian Francis Jennings' interpretation of Captain John Mason's attack on a village on the Mystic River near Long Island. Mason proposed to avoid attacking warriors, which would have overtaxed his unseasoned, unreliable troops. Battle, as such, was not his purpose. Battle is only one of the ways to destroy an enemy willing to live. Massacre can accomplish the same end with less risk, and Mason had determined that massacre would be his objective. So the English set fire to the wigwams of the village. By their own account, the captain said, "We must burn them," and immediately stepping into the wigwam, brought out a firebrand, putting it into the mats with which they were covered, and set them on fire. William Bradford, in his History of the Plymouth Plantation, written at the time, described John Mason's raid on the villages. Those who escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others ruined throughout. Hold on, okay, hold on. Trying to decipher these misspellings and okay. Others ruined, throw with their okay. So as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fryer, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice. And they gave the prayers there of God, who has wrought so wonderfully for them. Thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. As Dr. Cotton Mather, Puritan theologian, put it, it was supposed that no less than 600 Indian souls were brought to holy shit. It was supposed that no less than 600 Indian souls were brought down to hell that day. The war continued. Indian tribes were used against one another, and never seemed able to join together in fighting the English. Jennings sums it up. The terror was very real among the Indians, but in time they came to meditate upon its foundations. They drew 3 lessons from the war. 1, that the Englishman's most solemn pledge will be broken whenever obligation conflicted with advantage. 2, that the English way of war had no limit of mercy. And 3, that weapons of Indian making were almost useless against weapons of European manufacture. These lessons the Indians took to heart. A footnote in Virgil Vogel's book, This Land Was Ours, says, the official figure of the number of Indians now in Connecticut is 21 persons. Holy shit. This was written in 1972. So think 50 years from now, if it was 21 at the time, might be lucky if there's 1 left. 40 years after the war, Puritans and Indians fought again. This time, it was the Wampanoags occupying the south shore of Massachusetts Bay, who were in the way and also beginning to trade some of their land to people outside the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their chief, Massasoit, was dead. His son, Wamsuta, had been killed by Englishmen, and Wamsuta's brother, Metacom, later to be called King Philip by the Englishmen, became chief. The English found their excuse, a murder which they attributed to Metacom, and they began a war of conquest against the Hold on. Dang, I really should have. Need to get this laptop fixed. That's really what we need to do. Okay. They attributed... Okay. Let me start this whole sentence over. The English found their excuse, a murder which they attributed to Metacom, and they began a war of conquest against the Wampanoags, a war to take their land. They were clearly the aggressors, but claimed they attacked for preventive purposes. As Roger Williams, more friendly to the Indians than most, put it, all men of conscience plied to windward to maintain their wars to be defensive. Jennings says the elite of the Puritans wanted the war. Jennings says the elite of the Puritans wanted the war. The ordinary white Englishmen did not want it, and often refused to fight. The Indians certainly did not want war, but they matched atrocity with atrocity. When it was over, in 1676, the English had won, but their resources were drained. They had lost 600 men. 3,000 Indians were dead, including Metacom himself. Yet the Indian raids did not stop. And for a while, the English tried softer tactics, but ultimately it was back to annihilation. The Indian population of 10 million that lived north of Mexico when Columbus came would ultimately be reduced to less than 1 million. Huge numbers of Indians would die from diseases introduced by the whites. A Dutch traveler in the New Netherland wrote in 1656 that the Indians affirmed that before the arrival of the Christians and before the smallpox broke out amongst them, they were 10 times as numerous as they are now, and that their population has been melted down by disease, whereof 9/10 of them have died. Medical genocide. Genocide. A different form of genocide. It was, I think it's Terry that said this, that at times it was blankets and other things that were coated with smallpox, and they knew carried smallpox was purposely given to these Indians. When the English first settled Martha's Vineyard in 1642, the Wampanoags, I feel like I'm saying it differently every single time. I'm sorry. Their numbered perhaps 3,000. There were no wars on that island, but in 1764, only 313 Indians were left there. Similarly, Block Island Indians numbered perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 in 1662. By 1774, over 100 years, 112 years, that number was reduced to 51. Behind the English invasion of North America, behind their massacre of Indians, their deception, their brutality, was that special powerful drive, born in civilizations based on private property. It was a morally ambiguous drive. The need for space, for land, was a real human need. But in conditions of scarcity, in a history ruled by competition, this human need was transformed into the murder of whole peoples. Roger Williams said it was a depraved appetite for the great vanities, dreams and shadows of the vanishing life. Great portions of this land in this wilderness, as if men were in as great necessity and danger for want of great portions of land as poor, hungry, thirsty seamen have, after a long, sick, and stormy, starving passage. This is one of the gods of New England, which the living and Most High Eternal will destroy and famish. Well, okay, so we're gonna finish out chapter 1. Was all this bloodshed and deceit from Columbus to Cortez, Purrazzo, the Puritans, a necessity for the human race to progress from savagery to civilization? Was Morrison right in bearing the story of a genocide inside a more important story of human progress? Perhaps a persuasive argument can be made, as it was made by Stalin when he killed peasants for industrial progress in the Soviet Union, as it was made by Churchill explaining the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg, and by Truman explaining Hiroshima. But how can the judgment be made if the benefits and losses cannot be balanced because the losses are either unmentioned or are mentioned quickly? That quick disposal might be acceptable. Unfortunately, yes, but it had to be done to the middle and upper class of the conquering and advanced countries. But is it acceptable to the poor of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or to the prisoners of Soviet labor camps, or the Africans in urban ghettos, or the Indians on reservations, to the victims of that progress which benefits a privileged minority in the world? Was it acceptable, or just inescapable, to the miners and the railroaders of America, the factory hands, the men and women who died by the hundreds of thousands from accidents or sickness, where they worked or where they lived, casualties of progress? And even the privileged minority, must it not reconsider with that practicality which even privilege cannot abolish? The values of its privilege, when they become threatened by the anger of the sacrifice, when an organized rebellion, unorganized riot, or simply those brutal individuals, acts of desperate labeled crimes by law and the state? If there are necessary sacrifices to be made for human progress, is it not essential to hold to the principle that those to be sacrificed must make the decision themselves? We can all decide to give up something of ours, But do we have the right to throw into the fire the children of others, or even our own children, for a progress which is not nearly as clear or present as sickness or health, life or death? What did people in Spain get out of all the death and brutality visited on the Indians of the Americas? For a brief period in history, there was a glory of a Spanish empire in the Western Hemisphere. As Hans Koenig... Hold on, I gotta sneeze real quick. No, I don't. No, damn. As Hans Koenig sums it up in his book, Columbus, His Enterprise. For all the gold and silver stolen and shipped to Spain did not make the Spanish people richer. It gave their kings an edge in the balance of power for a time, a chance to hire more mercenary soldiers for their wars. They ended up losing those wars anyway. And all that was left was a deadly inflation, a starving population, the rich richer, the poor poorer, and a ruined peasant class. And this is something that carries out today. It can be seen, in all wars really, to where is nobody that really, the common citizen, common community member does not benefit from wars going on in Africa. Our wars going on in Afghanistan, our wars going on in Russia or Vietnam or anywhere, or in North Korea. The common person does not benefit, but the people who do benefit is 1%. Is the 1% who's making money selling those guns, who's making money off those bombs being dropped, who's making money off these crimes against humanity. Something about that don't feel right to me. Okay. Beyond all that, how certain are we that what was destroyed was inferior? Who were these people who came out on the beach and swam to bring presents to Columbus and his crew? Who watched Cortez and Pizarro ride through the countryside? Who peered out of the forest at the first white settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts? Columbus called them Indians because he miscalculated the size of the earth. In this book, we too call them Indians, with some reluctance, because it happens too often that people are saddled with names given to them by their conquerors. And yet, there is some reason to call them Indians, because they did come, perhaps, 25,000 years ago, from Asia, across a land bridge of the Bering Straits, later to disappear under water in Alaska. Okay, hold on. They then moved southward, seeking warmth and land, in a trek lasting thousands of years that took them into Northern America, then Central and South America. In Nicaragua, Brazil, and Ecuador, their petrified footprints can still be seen, along with a print of bison, who disappeared about 5,000 years ago. So they must have reached South America at least that far back. Actually, I've seen something post that said that they believe that people came to America far earlier than what is previously thought of. I seen that like a month, maybe 2 months ago. I'll have to go back and fully read it. Widely dispersed over the great landmass of the Americas, they numbered approximately 75 million people at the time of Columbus, perhaps 25 million in North America. Responding to the different environments of soil and climate, they developed hundreds of different tribal cultures, perhaps 2,000 different languages. They perfected the art of agriculture and figured out how to grow maize, which cannot grow by itself and must be planted, cultivated, fertilized, harvested, husked, and shelled. They ingeniously developed a variety of other vegetables and fruits. And usually fruits and vegetables? Why you say vegetables and fruits? As well as peanuts and chocolate and tobacco and rubber. On their own, the Indians were engaged. In the great agriculture revolution that other people in Asia, Europe, Africa were going through about the same time. While many of the tribes remain nomadic hunters and food gatherers and wandering egalitarian communes, others began to live in more settled communities where there was more food, larger populations, more divisions of labor among men and women, more surplus to feed chiefs and priests, more leisure for artistic and social work, for building houses. About 1,000 years before Christ, while comparable constructions were going on in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Zuni and Hopi Indians of what is now New Mexico had begun to build villages consisting of large buildings nestled in cliffs and mountains for protection against enemies, with hundreds of rooms in each village. Before the arrival of the European explorers, they were using irrigation canals, dams, were using ceramics, weaving baskets, and making cloth out of cotton. By the time of Christ and Julius Caesar, there had developed in the Ohio River Valley a culture of so-called Mound Builders, Indians who constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of earth, sometimes in the shape of huge humans, birds, or serpents, sometimes as burial sites, sometimes as fortifications. One of them, 3.5 miles long, enclosing 100 acres. These mound builders seem to have been part of a complex trading system of ornaments and weapons from as far off as the Great Lakes, the Far West, and the Gulf of Mexico. My fault. About AD 500, that's real weird to say. About AD 500, as this mound builder culture of the Ohio Valley was beginning to decline, another culture was developing westward, in the valley of the Mississippi, centered on what is now St. Louis. It had advanced agriculture, included thousands of villages, and also built huge earthen mounds as burial and ceremonial places near a vast Indian metropolis that may have had 30,000 people. The largest mound was 100 feet high, with a rectangular base larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. In the city known as Cahokia, Cauokia, were tool makers, hide dressers, potters, jewelry makers, weavers, salt makers, copper engravers, and magnificent ceramicists. One funeral blanket was made of 1,000 shell beads. from the from the at Adirondacks to the Great Lakes and what is now Pennsylvania and Upper New York lived the most powerful of the northeastern tribes. The land of the Iroquois, which included the Mohawks, people of the Flint, the Oneidas, people of the Stone, Onondagas, people of the mountain, Cayugas, people of the landing, and Senecas, great hill people. Thousands of people bound together by a common Iroquois language. In the vision of the Mohawk chief Hiawatha, the legendary the Kaniwada spoke to the Iroquois. We bind ourselves together by taking hold of each other's hands so firmly and forming a circle so strong that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake nor break it, so that our people and great-grandchildren shall remain in that circle in security, peace, and happiness. In the village of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together, and the catch was divided among the members of the village. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership of land and homes was foreign to the Iroquois. A French Jesuit priest who encountered them in the 1650s wrote, "No poor houses are needed among them, because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except in common." Women were important and respected in the Iroquois society. Families were matrilineal. That is, the family line went down through the female members, whose husband joined the family, while sons who married then joined their wife's family. Each extended family lived in a longhouse. When a woman wanted a divorce, When a woman wanted a divorce, she set her husband's things outside the door. Families were grouped in clans, and a dozen or more clans might make up a village. The senior women in the village named the men who represented the clans at village and tribunal councils. They also named the 49 chiefs who were the ruling council of the Five Nations Confederacy of the Iroquois. The women attended clan meetings, not with a K, stood behind the circle of men who spoke and voted, and removed the men from office if they strayed too far from the wishes of the women. The women tended the crops and took general charge of village affairs, while the men were always hunting or fishing. And since they supplied moccasins and food for expeditions, they had some control over military matters. As Gary B. Nash notes in his fascinating study of early America, Red, White, and Black, thus power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominancy and female subordination in all things were conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. Children in Iroquois society, while taught the cultural heritage of their people and solidarity with their tribe, were also taught to be independent, not to submit to overbearing authority. That's almost the exact opposite of what kids is taught in school today. What kids is taught in school today. They were taught equality and status and the sharing of possessions. The Iroquois did not use harsh punishment on children. They did not insist on early weaning or early toilet training, but gradually allowed the children to learn self-care. All of this was in sharp contrast to European values as brought over by the first colonists, a society of rich and poor, controlled by priests, by governors, by male heads of families. For example, the pastor of the Pilgrim colony, John Robinson, thus advised his parishioners how to deal with their children. Okay, this is a quote from John Robinson. And surely there is in all children a stubbornness and stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must in the first place be broken and beaten down. He's talking about children like this. So the foundation of their education being laid in humility and tractableness, other virtues may in their time be built upon. Gary Nash describes Iroquois cultures. No laws and ordinances, sheriffs, judges and juries, or courts or jails. The apparatus of authority in European society were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to the European arrival. Yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Though priding themselves on the autonomous individual, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. He who stole food from another or acted invalorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he had atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had been morally purified himself. Not only the Iroquois, but other Indian tribes behaved the same way. In 1635, Maryland Indians responded to the governor's demand that if any of them killed an Englishman, the guilty one should be delivered up for punishment according to English law. The Indians said, "It is the manner amongst Indians that if any such accident we do redeem the life of a man that is slain with 100 arms length of beads. And since that you here are strangers and come into our country, you should rather conform yourselves to the customs of our country than impose yours upon us." So Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world with which, in some places, was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, and children and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their own poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 1930s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, could we make it our own, there would be an eternal, inexhaustible, my fault. Let me start that over. Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace. Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that, but the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, put together recently by American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that. Overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Perfections of myths. It is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuses of progress and the annihilations of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of conquerors and the leaders of Western civilization. That is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is titled Drawing the Color Line, but we're going to stop there. And again, I feel like it should be noted, it should be stated what I have read this before, so I do am aware of some of these things, but for a large part, for the large majority of the things, these are things that are untaught, that are not taught in school, or like he has said, that are taught in passing, just little remarks as they go. Never in full detail, never do any justice upon indigenous people's culture, upon their language, or anything of that nature. Genocide. Killed them by the thousands for personal greed, for exploitation, for this is a really difficult book to read, but I feel like, again, I do feel like it is an important book to read, because it's important to know how we got to these places and how what led us here. Where are we now? How did we come about? What came before us? How did people handle things that came before us? How did they handle things? What worked previously, and what could work again? So this really might be the most important book that I've ever read. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. That concludes Chapter 1. I don't believe Chapter 2 is overly long. No, it's not at all. So I'll probably pick back up, do another live in the evening, probably pick back up reading tomorrow, though. So, I'm not sure which day this is, but the struggle continues.